The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Francis Scott Fitzgerald.
Quasi Organisms and Infocloning.
The topic of this chapter could easily fill an entire book, but we'll aim to just skim the surface. That should be enough to understand the material that follows. Let's start by recalling that in the chapter, What is the Meaning of Life?, we defined the concept of the model of the universe, a reflection of the behavioral scheme adapted by subjective entities to maintain their homeostasis. A subjective entity doesn't think about the universe in terms like, the universe consists of this and that which interacts with such and such. No, it simply knows a set of scenarios and reactions, meaning it can recognize certain situations and respond to them appropriately. In that same chapter, I promised the reader that we'd return to the question of the differences between context and the model of the universe. At this point, we know that context is the sum of knowledge about oneself and the surrounding world of just one particular living being or proto-living entity of a certain species, whereas the model of the universe is something like the integral collective context of the entire population of beings, entities of that species. First, let's clarify how far apart individual contexts can be from the corresponding group knowledge, the model of the universe. If we're talking about the context of a single human and the model of the universe of humanity, then humanity's model of the universe is always guaranteed to be broader and deeper than any individual's context. Even the most brilliant and well-informed person cannot know or master everything that humanity has accumulated. We're born with practically zero context, and as we grow, we interpret a vast number of different texts received from parents, peers, teachers, as well as from books, media, the internet, etc. Step by step, interpreting all these texts forms, expands and deepens our individual context.
Learning is the step-by-step formation of individual context through the interpretation of various texts.
Now, let's take a look at how things stand with the context of brainless entities, plants, bacteria, proteins, and other proto-living entities. It turns out that the individual contexts of lower forms of life are practically indistinguishable from the corresponding group model of the universe, since these contexts are not formed through learning, but are somehow innately received. For over 100 years, biologists have used the very vague term instinct, which they define as innate behavioral patterns that do not require learning or experience. Unfortunately, biologists have no real understanding of how this mysterious instinct program gets loaded into a living creature. The only clear thing is this: unlike classical learning, where context is formed step by step through the interpretation of texts, in the case of instinct, context appears almost instantaneously and in its entirety. For example, no one teaches a mosquito how to fly or explains to it how to track down a juicy, though strangely aggressive, blood-filled creature called a human. The mosquito somehow immediately knows how to find food and how to obtain it. This knowledge and skill context are inexplicably loaded into it from birth, straight from the common mosquito model of the universe. Let's now, within the paradigm of the great life, theorize about how lower forms of life might already have a fully formed context right from the moment of birth. In other words, how they acquire this thing we call instinct. It seems to me that what we're dealing with here are certain quasi-organisms. For example, one such quasi-organism is called mosquitoes. This quasi-organism has been living for many hundreds of thousands of years across vast territories, virtually the entire solid surface of the Earth, except perhaps Antarctica. Each individual mosquito is something like a cell in a traditional organism, a kind of autonomous tentacle, while all mosquitoes on the planet together form the body of this quasi-organism.
A quasi-organism is a representative of life, whose body is not enclosed within a single continuous shell, but instead takes the form of a colony of similar, autonomous, subjective entities, belonging to a lower level of life's hierarchy.
Just as a cell in a traditional organism is born already knowing and capable of everything its neighboring cells know and can do, so too a newly born mosquito knows and can do everything its neighboring mosquitoes can. It seems that the instinct of each individual mosquito is literally the context of this greater quasi-organism. That is, mosquitoes simply share common access to that context. In other words, the quasi-organism simply clones its collective context, that is, its model of the universe, into the individual contexts of its newborn members.
Infocloning is the mechanism by which the contexts of similar subjective entities are formed through shared access to the context of the quasi-organism that generates them.
The same can be said of the quasi-organism birches, the quasi-organism ferns, the quasi-organism chlorella, the quasi-organism Streptococcus bacteria, and of many millions of other quasi-organisms we collectively refer to as species of lower life forms. From the chapter, What is God? We remember that for any subjective entity, God is simply the consciousness of a being that exists on a higher level of life's hierarchy. Therefore, we can say that lower and proto-living forms of life are almost dissolved within their God. That is, they are practically inseparable from their quasi-organism.
And does the quasi-organism humans exist?
If we're talking about the preloaded program of our reflexes and instincts, then we shouldn't be referring to a quasi-organism called humans, but rather to a quasi-organism called hairless apes. After all, an info-cloned but untrained Mowgli isn't a human in the social sense of the word. Thus, the quasi-organism hairless apes represents the level of the life hierarchy directly above ours. That is, it is our very own Missy. And the consciousness of this quasi-organism is none other than our very own God.
Our God is the consciousness of the quasi-organism, hairless apes.
Disappointed? Surprised? You shouldn't be. Every one of our animal reflexes and instincts comes from this quasi-creature.
So where then does all our humanity come from? Surely there must be a quasi-organism humans as well.
As I mentioned earlier, that's a topic for a whole separate book. I hope that after becoming familiar with the paradigm of the great life, readers will develop their own ideas on the matter. For instance, psychologists might associate the consciousness of the quasi-organism humans with Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. Sociologists might link it to the idea of the collective consciousness, and fans of esoterica to the notion of the egregore. In my opinion, all these ideas are worth serious consideration, whereas in the framework of the paradigm of the Great Graveyard, they've always been regarded as purely fringe. And just a few more words about the relationship between individuality and uniformity in subjective entities. Each individual mosquito, or each individual birch tree, bacterium, and so on, differs from each individual human in that it possesses almost no individuality. As we've previously established, individuality is achieved through learning, and mosquitoes, as well as birches, bacteria, and the like, have a very limited capacity for learning. In other words, the context of any living or proto-living being is always a kind of blend of individuality and uniformity. That is, a mix of the results of learning and infocloning. Learning is a much more complex, and it should be noted, rather unreliable, since every time you have to start from scratch, handcrafted method of forming individual contexts. However, it provides enormous diversity in competing ideas and viewpoints, and thus life can comparatively quickly arrive at an extremely developed model of the universe. Infocloning, on the other hand, is an incredibly reliable industrial method of forming individual contexts, but as a technology for cognition, it's far less promising. All individuals of the species turn out exactly the same, so the improvement of its model of the universe can only occur through lucky mutations. In other words, it seems that
the dominance of individuality over uniformity in identical subjective entities is a sign of a more advanced model of the universe in that form of life.
This is a very important conclusion, and it will come in handy in appendices. But for now,
Summary.
A quasi-organism is a representative of life, whose body is not enclosed in a single continuous shell, but is a colony of identical, autonomous, subjective entities of a lower level in the hierarchy of life. Learning is the step-by-step formation of an individual context through the interpretation of various texts. Infocloning is the mechanism by which the context of subjective entities is formed through shared access to the context of the quasi-organism that constitutes them. Our God is the consciousness of the quasi-organism, hairless apes. The dominance of individuality over uniformity in identical subjective entities is a sign of a more advanced model of the universe in that form of life.